Okay, so I want to welcome one of our fabulous New York therapists, Maddie. Maddie, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Hi,
Yeah.
everyone.
Hi. So today we're talking about such an interesting topic that you have really brought to the practice that I honestly hadn't really thought about as like its own thing. I had kind of just thought about it as something that is I guess it just hasn't really been named in a really effective way, but it's the term sexual identity, right? So on one hand, you have your sexual orientation, and now we're talking about something called sexual identity. And if if you could just help kind of explain a little bit about like what the difference between the two is, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think sexual orientation just describes emotional, romantic, or sexual attraction that is really geared towards a particular gender or genders, right? And I think, which can be more binary, I think, at times. And I think sexual identity just opens up for more exploration, more nuance, more curiosity in terms of sexual, emotional, and romantic attraction to all different types of people. Um, so I think it just kind of opens the door to many different kinds of human sexual experiences.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess like the way that I'm kind of understanding it on a very basic level, and just I guess correct me if you feel like I'm saying this in any sort of uh wrong way. But I'm viewing sexual orientation as like even the word orientation, it's like who or what you're kind of like facing. It's about like the direction of your attraction. So like my orientation is towards people of a certain gender identity or certain body parts, right? Like it's really about like the direction. It's sort of more external. And then sexual identity, I'm thinking is like more about the kind of very fluid way that you might relate to your own sexual energy, like what kind of works for you sexually. And and yeah, it's less about like the other person, it's more about like your own kind of inner workings of how you connect to your sexual energy. Does that feel kind of like somewhat right?
Yeah, 100%. I think with sexual identity, it's just a higher level of connection to yourself and just how you relate to others, yeah, sexually or romantically. And right, I think the sexual orientation is sort of an umbrella term that we use that maybe we identify as gay, we identify as straight, and that's sort of a lifelong pattern. But sexual identity really allows for new experience to come and affect us, and maybe we used to act or, behave in some different ways because of that.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's really not something that I have thought that much about. And now that you're opening it up, I'm thinking so much about it. And I wonder if we could sort of go into some examples of what sexual identities are. Like what are some of the common sexual identities? Like what is one that like what's the first one that comes to mind?
I think the one, I mean, I think asexual comes to mind in terms of maybe having, maybe not no interest, but maybe having little interest in sexual activities or behaviors. I think demisexual, I hear, that comes up a lot, which is also sort of on the asexual spectrum in terms of really needing that emotional connection involved before engaging in sexual behavior. Um,
Hmm.
Certainly like the fluid term that comes up a lot, and just kind of or pansexual coming up a lot in terms of different gender identities. Yeah, attraction to all types of people.
Right. So, again, I guess we're talking about ways that, like with demisexuality, it's more about what you need to feel connected to somebody. It's not about the kind of gender identity or parts of the other person. It's like, I need to feel an emotional connection in order to feel aroused, right?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Yeah, and I think it less is about maybe the gender of that person themselves. It's more about this is the emotional, romantic connection that I have to this person, regardless of body parts.
Mhm.
It's that, yeah, that connection that can't be
Hmm.
sort of named, but it's just inherently there. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I really appreciate you naming this. I'm also thinking I'm working on a piece right now which kind of tied into your piece this week about sexual identities, about fray sexuality. And this is a really kind of new term that I just learned, which is people who um, really feel aroused when intimacy is not involved. So it's more like about casual, anonymous sex, novel sex, and then when intimacy does get involved, it's less arousing or not arousing at all. And so
Hmm.
you might consider it like the opposite of demisexuality in a way, like if we're viewing that as a spectrum, the more connection that someone feels, actually, the less turned on they feel.
Yeah, that was also a new term for me, but when I read up more about it, I was like, "Oh, this makes a lot of sense." Even sort of kind of feeling like, "Oh, that sort of describes actually some of my own
Yeah.
experiences, past and present especially."
Mhm.
And I think that's like the really great thing about this topic of sexual identity is that it's just normalizing all sexual experiences for everybody and there's that empowering aspect like oh okay and for some people it's like oh there's a name or there's terminology for it that makes so much sense to me. I feel much more validated in not feeling like oh is this weird or strange of how
Mhm.
I interact sexually with people. So that was a really cool little discovery I had as well too.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. I think that's such a common desire. I've experienced it myself too, and I think as treating a lot of gay males in therapy and queer males in therapy, that is something that comes up a lot, and there can be this narrative like, oh, intimate sex with intimacy is like the gold standard, and everything else feels like a little bit dirty or something.
Right.
And so I think when you can actually embrace that, oh no, this actually might be my sexual identity, that this is how I relate to my sexual energy, that can be a bit empowering for you to actually come at it from a very mindful place instead of like feeling like this is something I need to keep compartmentalized.
Yeah, 100%. Or, we're whatever our behaviors are, it's like sometimes we feel the need to pathologize them or feeling like something that I'm doing is not right or I need to be acting in this sort of way. And especially, we're all living in a heteronormative society. It's really easy to think that way that we're engaging with others sexually is somehow wrong, or like you said, there is like a gold standard that we need to sort of be adhering to. So it's just nice to like get out of your head in that sense.
Yeah, I think it's so empowering to like open up the space within you to think about like how do I relate to my own sexual energy? Not really about like who am I attracted to or what body parts I'm attracted to or what turns me on the most in terms of like the external, but what do I need to actually connect to this powerful energy inside of me?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I feel like it's just getting more in touch with yourself and just understanding yourself more and essentially just living more in what feels truthful and authentic to you. And when we're all living in that sort of state, it's like we're not doing anything wrong. And we're getting the consent of other people. We're not doing anything wrong.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Right. Yeah, the other one that I'm now thinking of, the other sexual identity I'm now thinking of is sapiosexuality too, which is people who need to feel an intellectual connection in order to feel aroused. Right? That's actually not one that I hear as often in therapy, but I've definitely interacted with people that are that way in my personal life.
Yeah, I also have never interacted with someone who strictly engages with someone based on intellect, but of course we all know people that, we meet somebody, we sort of like them, and it's like, oh, they're okay. And then as you get to know them more, and maybe you discover that there's this intellectual side to them, I think that just adds to the romantic sexual connection. So I can really see how it sort of like ups the ante. But I haven't worked with somebody yet who's like, oh yeah, like I really get down with somebody who's got the smarts. You know what I mean?
Right. Or at least like that is the gateway towards sexuality. Like I need to feel like they have a strong intellect in order for that door to open, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder if we can just talk a little bit about like, you know, exploring your own sexual identity, like making that space for yourself. Like therapy, queer affirming therapy is such a good space to have that exploration. But can you just talk about like, you know, any advice you have for um people like if someone is just starting their journey of like discovering well, what is my maybe I know that I'm gay or maybe I know that I'm trans or maybe I know that I'm queer but I'm not really sure about my sexual identity like how I relate to my sexual energy or what I need to feel sexual. What would you say in terms of like any sort of advice for that exploration period?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just first I would just tell people to keep listening to yourself. Just like keep believing yourself. If there's things that are coming up that you want to explore, just like tap into that with some curiosity. Just keep noticing it. Maybe there's no need to necessarily put judgment on it or feel or pathologize it or feel maybe some sort of negative way about it, but just be open to sort of what is going on. And then I think the great thing about the queer community is that if there's a sexual interest or there's a sexual identity, there's oftentimes a community for it. And there's often an outlet, or there's other people that are feeling and experiencing the exact same thing that you are. So I would just sort of see if there's other communities in your area or other people that you know. Talk about this stuff with people, with other queer folks. Like, does this ever, I like have this like feeling I kind of want to do this. Like, does that ever happen for you? You'll probably find out that other people have had similar thoughts or also have had similar experiences.
Yeah, that's such good advice. Just kind of like trying to open up a space for yourself that is not shame driven. To explore. I always tell people in therapy that you should be having fun. You know, like when you're exploring a sexual identity, sexual orientation, like it should be fun. Like
Right.
it gets this pressure put on it by the world, you know, like the heteronormative world. But actually it should be a really fun process.
Yeah. 100% right. It's like we're already feeling so much shame and pressure and whatever from the outside world. It's like try not to allow yourself to fall into that trap too, right?
Yeah. And when shame does come in too, shame and sex are often so closely connected. That's the case for everybody, particularly I think in the queer community, just because we had so much shame growing up around it. But um,
Yeah.
I think there's a way in which when shame does come in, you can actually view that as not the worst thing, but learn how to play with the shame a little bit too. Like that's kind of like what the basis of kink is like kind of playing with shame. And so I don't know, now we're kind of getting into this murky territory of orientation versus identity, but I do think that when you're setting up that playful space for yourself, also, it's okay if shame comes into it. And actually that can be part of the exploration too.
Yeah, I think that's also really empowering what you said is taking that shame and sort of like turning it on its head. Um, and just sort of right, recognizing that it can be there, but it doesn't have to be super disruptive, but just allowing it to be there, accepting that it might come up, and also exploring that with yourself and maybe other sexual partners as well. Because, right, especially as queer people, that's universal. That's coming up for all of us at times.
Yeah. Yeah, this has been so great and helpful. I think I think probably the last thing I would say is like don't feel like there needs to be some linear ending point to your exploration. That sexual identity, I think you'd agree with me, Maddie, is something that is like shifting for all of us, and we're working through certain defenses that open up a new pathway to a different type of sexuality. And so even if you do land somewhere, that's fantastic, and also be open to what might shift over time.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's the great thing about this language and this terminology is that it's just that. It provides so many opportunities for people to either define, some of their identity or not define themselves, but really just allows people to navigate um, in whatever ways that feel most authentic to themselves, which I think is one of the most important aspects of all this.
Yeah, thank you so much, Maddie. I just want to say overall, thanks for bringing this subject to the practice. It's really, as much as we think we are a queer specialized practice, we know all the identities, we know about this community, then like something new comes up and it's like, oh yeah, we haven't actually thought that much about sexual identity. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. I'm so glad that I was able to help out a little bit. So that's really cool.
Thanks, Maddie.
Thank you.